World War II was still raging in Europe when Churchill took the plane from London to Rome. And in Rome, he went to the Vatican, where he had a very private meeting with Pope Pius XII. At the end of the meeting, Churchill returned to the British Embassy where he was staying, very much absorbed in his own thoughts. And when his personal physician, Lord Moran, came to greet him, the curious physician, who afterwards published the memoirs of his years with Churchill, asked him what happened. And to his amazement, Churchill, instead of giving details of the meeting, proceeded to give, from memory, a quotation from a famous British Protestant historian that lasted about 4 minutes. Word for word, he declaimed it. And it was a most unusual quotation because this British historian, in spite of his anti-Catholic bias, could not hold back his astonishment and amazement and sense of awe at the Catholic Church's record in history. It begins, I'll just quote a small section, "There is not, and there never was on this earth, a work so well deserving of examination as the Roman Catholic Church. The history of that Church joins together the two great ages of human civilization. No other institution is left standing which carries the mind back to the times when the smoke of sacrifice rose from the Pantheon. Catholicism saw the commencement of all the governments and of all the ecclesiastical establishments that now exist in the world, and we feel no assurance that she is not destined to see the end of them all. She was great and respected before the Saxon had set foot on Britain, before the Frank had passed the Rhine," and so on and so forth. When Churchill had finished, the physician was further taken aback by a most startling personal remark from the only nominally Christian, because he had never received a Christian education, Lion of England. I quote, "Churchill said that he felt that there must be something in a faith that could survive so many centuries and had held captive so many men." And as Churchill spoke those words, the physician saw that he had tears in his eyes. We Catholics know where that something is. The one true religion in which alone man can find the divinely revealed certainties and the supernatural energy and the mystical fellowship, crossing time and eternity, empowering us to honour God and so achieve eternal salvation. But in this lecture I am going to argue, drawing from the conclusions of historians and sociologists, Jewish, Protestant, and some Catholic, that what more than anything else made men captive to Catholicism in the first 1,000 years when Western civilization was being built was a single institution, a most surprising institution, called the traditional Latin Mass. The outline of this lecture is therefore in 2 parts. Part 1, I will present the verdict of history, the evidence that shows that the traditional Mass and liturgy was the chief means, not the exclusive one, but the most important, wherein the Catholic artistic, social and political vanguards of Europe, as well as the so-called ordinary people, often so extraordinary, found inspiration to build a new lifestyle, culture and civilization. In part 2, I will give 11 reasons, one after the other, why the masses of Europe and the elites of Europe were so attached to this ancient Mass. All of these reasons point to why our Catholic forefathers discovered in this ancient ceremony the mysterious something that Churchill alluded to. In it they found Catholicism packaged in a way they could both understand and cherish. It was the way Catholicism spoke to them, clearly, transparently, lucently, at times tenderly, at times thunderously, but always in a way that they cherished. To support this controversial argument, I will draw not only upon Catholics, as I said, but upon Jewish, Protestant, atheist and secularist sociologists and historians. The conclusion will be, therefore, what Catholic vanguards did before, because of this institution, the traditional Latin Mass, they can and they will do again. Already, many of the most avant-garde Catholics who are resisting the onslaught of secularism in Europe are attached to the traditional Latin Mass. For example, the British politician, the head of the Speaker of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example, the Interior Minister in the Italian government, the last government, before they were thrown out by the entire European establishment, but they'll be back because they're now the most popular party in Italy. And in the United States, by the throngs of young people who are causing the opening of traditional Latin Mass churches in almost every major city in the United States right now. Part 1. The influence of the traditional Latin liturgy on the European elites who created Western culture and civilization. First of all, I will begin with the influence of the traditional Latin Mass on the elites who abandoned Catholicism and became her most violent enemies. And I will begin with the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. There is a remarkable painting by the French painter Jean-Baptiste Moses entitled "The Emperor Napoleon on his deathbed, 1 hour before his funeral." It shows the man who had conquered Europe lying on his iron bed in military uniform with his military jacket, medals attached to his jacket. But larger than all the medals, on his chest is a massive crucifix. On his bedside table one sees a lit candle and a container with holy water. Standing beside his bed are 2 men, one of his courtiers and a Catholic priest, Father Vignali, whom Napoleon had written to the Pope for, requesting that this priest come to assist him to cross the final frontier. In the priest's hands is the traditional Latin ritual containing the prayers for the dead. It was 10 o'clock a.m., May the 9th, 1821. The place, Napoleon's exile home, amid the South Atlantic on the island of St. Helena. Around it, ceaselessly a British warship circles to make sure that the feared enemy of Britain would never again escape back to Europe as he had done before. On April the 15th, 3 weeks before, Napoleon had begun his last will and testament with the following remarkable words. I quote, "I die in the apostolic and Roman religion, in the bosom of which I was born more than 50 years ago." End quote. 6 days after beginning it, he called for Father Vignali and told him, as the historian Laurent de Lardèche states, I quote, "I was born into the Catholic religion. I wish to fulfill the duties that it imposes and receive the sources of strength it administers." On May the 3rd, at 2 o'clock p.m., 2 days before his death, when his fever was less violent, he made his confession and received absolution. Then he was sealed for the final journey with the sacrament of extreme unction. Stomach cancer prevented him from receiving Holy Communion, but perhaps the most revealing fact about the final days of Napoleon was that the dying man had ordered that the dining room adjacent to his bedroom be converted into a chapel. Moreover, he wanted the ancient Latin Mass to be celebrated as frequently as possible in that dining room, and he wanted the doors kept open so that he could be present at it each time. On top of that, in the appendix to his will, before all else, he wrote the following: "The consecrated vessels for the Mass that were used in my chapel at Longwood, these I command Father Vignale to preserve and to hand them over to my son when he reaches the age of 16. Thus were the final days and some of the final words of the man who had dominated Europe, whose armies had persecuted the Catholic Church wherever they went, closing its chapels and monasteries, creating a society in which at every turn it was controlled by the powerful state apparatus. The man who had arrived to Rome, arrested Pope Pius VI, who died in one of his prisons, then came back in 1809, 10 years later, and imprisoned Pope Pius VII, who was only released after the Battle of Waterloo. And yet, the persecutor, in his final days, wanted to die, as he stated, fulfilling the duties of the religion I was born into. For 2,000 years, sociologists and historians have noted that this was the pattern up to the 1960s. Men and women who had abandoned Catholicism asked to be received back into the ranks of her members. Clearly, even after their departure, something of her had remained inside them. Something haunted them almost. It remained, whether as nostalgia or rancor or a mixture of both, but never indifference. For instance, Voltaire, who at the end of every single one of his letters signed off with the phrase, "Écrasez l'infâme," crush, wipe out the horror. And the horror was the Roman Catholic Church. And yet every time he came close to death, some 6 times during his life, he called for the priests of the Catholic Church to prepare him for death. So too Salvador Dali, who returned to the church in 1942 and who in 1951 painted the masterpiece Christ of St. John of the Cross, stating, I quote, "My main concern was to paint a Christ as beautiful as the very God that he incarnates." And 4 years later he revealed the secret of why he was haunted by Catholicism in another painting, entitled The Sacrament of the Last Supper. So too, with our fellow Irishman, we may not be too proud of him at times, but he was an Irishman, Oscar Wilde, who had become fascinated by Catholicism precisely after attending Mass at Oxford University. After that Mass, he wrote, I paraphrase, "It is the only religion worth dying in." On November the 29th, 1900, the dying Wilde entered the Roman Catholic Church. Father Cuthbert Dunn, the Irish priest who administered the sacraments to him, described the dramatic scene as follows, I quote, "As the car rolled through the dark streets that wintry night, the sad story of Oscar Wilde was in part repeated to me. Upon arrival, Robert Ross knelt by the bedside, assisting me as best he could while I administered conditional baptism, and afterwards answering the responses while I gave extreme unction to the prostrate man and recited the prayers for the dying. Since Wilde was in a semi-comatose condition, I did not venture to administer the Holy Viaticum. Still, I must add that he could be roused, and was roused from this state in my presence. When roused, he gave signs of being inwardly conscious. Indeed, I was fully satisfied that he understood me when I told him that I was about to receive him into the Catholic Church. And when I repeated close to his ear the holy names, the acts of contrition, of faith, hope and charity, with acts of humble resignation to the will of God, he tried all through to say the words after me. It's puzzling. It's enigmatic. It's mysterious. Why did such men, after a lifetime away from Catholicism, make such dramatic turnaround decisions in their final days? They caused consternation among psychologists, sociologists, historians. Why did Catholicism, up to the 1960s, have this mysterious magnetism, fascination, ability to haunt even those who spend most of their lives trying to destroy her? When scrutinized by sociological analyses, such as the brilliant analysis by the Frenchman Frédéric Gougelot, La conversion des intellectuels au catholicisme en France, published in 2000, they all point to the powerful and decisive impact of the traditional Latin Mass. The French sociologist, in his carefully footnoted analysis of the circumstances and motives to the conversion to Catholicism of 150 intellectuals, atheists, agnostics, Jews, Protestants, everything, such as Paul Claudel, Jacques Maritain himself, who at the beginning was all right, went well, Henri Guéon, shows this magnetizing ability of the Mass of the ages. One of the converts, Gabriel Friseau, wrote, "I went while waiting to enter Catholicism, into the churches, not knowing what I was searching for, being present without fully understanding the ceremonies of worship that attracted me mysteriously. My heart heavy, I felt over me a fear, a hope." Another convert, one of the 20th century's greatest dramatists, nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 6 different years, Paul Claudel, who had distanced himself from the church in his early teens, had a sudden conversion during the liturgy. He wrote of it, "This was the man who on Christmas Day 1886 went to Notre Dame in Paris for the Christmas Mass. And it was there that the thing happened that has dominated my entire life. In an instant my heart was touched and I believed." This continued up to the 60s. For instance, in the 1960s, the infamous Jack Kerouac, an American novelist who was an underground celebrity, a pioneer of the Beat generation that promoted psychedelic drugs and unrestrained sexual license, was a man who had grown up with Catholicism, and he remained haunted by Catholicism throughout his life. Writing to a friend, he stated, "The Catholic Church is a weird church. Much mysticism is sown broadspread from its ritual mysteries till it extends into the very lives of its constituents and parishioners." End quote. Kerouac sometimes revealed how deeply ingrained in him was the spirit of Catholicism, even when he became one of the leaders of the avant-garde of the hippie movement. A biographer noted that when somebody would speak to him about things like racism and violence, classifying them as issues, Kerouac would fly into a rage and would speak in Catholic lingo. He would reply, "Issues," and he'd speak with a curling sneer. "Issues." And then he would use the F word. He'd say, "F issues." They're not issues, they're sins. And for that, only penance is possible. This from one of the leaders of the 1968 revolution in the United States. A second group of individuals who belong to the elites shows the magnetizing influence of the traditional Mass in creating the masterpieces of European culture. All historians of art, whether they have ever entered a Catholic church or not, are in agreement. Western high culture exists because of Roman Catholicism. It seems to have cast a spell over architects, musicians, poets, novelists, from as soon as the Catholics emerged from the catacombs. And it exerted a spell over them through the traditional Latin Mass and liturgy. As the historian Christopher Dawson wrote, I quote, "Everything that the Christian world possessed of ideas and poetry, music and art was poured into the liturgy, moulded into an organic whole which centered around the divine mysteries." Why and how did this happen? In the history of the human spirit, there has never been any other ceremony like the traditional Latin Mass that has so hypnotized the creative minorities of any civilization. This historical fact was brought to light in the Times of London on July the 6th, 1971, in a remarkable letter signed by 56 world-famous musicians, writers, philosophers and artists, Jewish, secularist, Protestant, Catholic. They addressed the letter to the Pope, asking for what they called the Mass of the Ages, one of the most, I quote, grandiose manifestations of high culture, end quote, to be preserved. Among the signatories were Agatha Christie, Barbara Hepworth, our own Sean of Wailoin, Nancy Mitford, Kenneth Clark, Yehudi Menuhin, Robert Graves, Graham Greene, Vladimir Ashkenazi, Iris Murdoch. They wrote, "The rite in question, in its magnificent Latin text, has also inspired a host of priceless achievements in the arts, not only mystical works, but works by poets, philosophers, musicians, architects, painters and sculptors in all countries, in all epochs. Thus it belongs to universal culture as well as to churchmen and formal Christians." I could go on for hours on the works of art the traditional Mass gave. Historians now recognize that the modern dramas of Shakespeare, Lope de Vega, Calderon, Molière and Schiller sprang not from classical Greco-Roman drama, but from within the dramatical ethos of the Catholic Mass. Likewise with architecture. Nobody can understand a Gothic, Baroque, Romanesque, neoclassical, basilica, cathedral, without understanding that they were built for only one purpose, the high altar of the traditional Latin Mass. Everything was focused on that altar with a ceremony attached to it, the traditional Mass of the Ages. Musicians competed with each other. Palestrina, Bach, Schubert, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Berlioz, Bruckner, Monteverdi, Josquin, Rossini, Britten, Stravinsky, Vaughan, Williams, Fauré, Messager, Liszt, Kodali, and so on, right up to the 16-year-old who in 2016 in the United States, a young kid who goes to the traditional Latin Mass, a musical genius who may in the end rival Mozart, composed the magnificent, beautiful Mass of St. Gregory, which you can listen to on the internet. But the ancient Mass did not just impact Western civilization's artistic elites. It dominated the imaginations of the kings and political elites of Europe. This morning I told you how Theodosius humiliated himself in the square of Milan in order to have admission again to this Mass. Some of the kings of Europe came to love it deeply. Charlemagne, after a visit to Rome, fell so in love with the ancient Latin Mass that he wanted it established in his own kingdom, where there was a slightly different version, the Gallican Celtic version, which was practically speaking almost the same, the Mass of St. Patrick, which was practically the same as the traditional Latin Mass, but slightly different. Charlemagne loved the traditional Latin Mass, and eventually he got it. So did Louis IX of France, who attended every single day. Sometimes he went into ecstasy in Mass and would forget time. His bodyguards waiting outside for him used to become a little bit annoyed about that. Louis XVI, the morning he was led off to the guillotine, demanded that he go to the ancient Mass to prepare himself. And he walked to the guillotine, leaning on the arm of the priest who said that Mass, and to our glory, he was an Irish priest, Father Henry Essex Edgemont de Firmont, whom even the revolutionaries recognized, were in awe of as a man of heroic grandeur. And how the ordinary people of Europe, the ordinary, extraordinary people, loved that Mass. From the pinewood chapels of Norway to the stone cathedrals of Chartres, records prove it. Last wills, testaments, confraternity, chantry, guild records, canonization processes, church wardens, records, material artifacts. They loved their Mass. It was their Mass. They built with their own hands these churches, these cathedrals. They went to the quarries. There were no building construction companies. They went to the quarries, and the nobles and the aristocracy went with them. And side by side they quarried the stones to build the cathedrals of Europe. All sectors of the ordinary people, even from a surprising fringe class, the prostitutes. Historical records show that in the case of Notre Dame in Paris, the bishop, somewhat reluctantly, only after consulting a moral theologian, quietly accepted a chalice or a window, medieval discretion prevents us from knowing which, from the guild of prostitutes. Why? Why did he accept? Because, as one historian explained, briefly and profoundly, in 2 words, because they believed. The ordinary people were so attached to the Mass that when the Protestant political revolutionaries arrived, they had to spend a century deceiving the people gradually that the Protestant ritual was almost the same as the Catholic Mass. They did this in England, they did this in Wales, they did this in Scotland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and many parts of Germany. During the penal laws, your ancestors and mine went to the hills and distant spots in the glens of Ireland, to the Mass rocks. Irish men, women and children went for the sake of the Mass of the ages, while watch was kept for the priest hunters. And in France, the Catholics of the Vendée, during the Revolution in 1793, for the sake of the Mass, fought for it and suffered what historians now recognize as the first genocide in modern history. This concludes part 1. Now part 2. Why? Why do they so cherish this ancient Mass? Why were they so attached to it? Why can Catholics today equip themselves through the Mass of the ages to begin the long march through the institutions in order to build the original culture and world order of a Catholic civilization. 11 reasons, very briefly, to the point. Number 1, because in the Mass of the Ages you will discover your identity. Rootlessness is the key characteristic that is being achieved by what Benedict XVI called the dictatorship of relativism. We are now living the fulfillment of George Orwell's description of the totalitarian state in his novel 1984. I quote, "Every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered, and the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right." This lack of sense of identity is due to 2 causes. 1, the structure of the mass media, as it is controlled largely right now by the big 4, GAFA, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. Secondly, by the powerful push towards political globalization. On October the 1st, 2010, the then Google CEO Eric Schmidt declared during an interview, and I quote, "With your permission, you give us more information about you, about your friends, and we can improve the quality of our searches." But then he added, "We don't need you to type at all. We know where you are. We know where you've been. We can more or less now know what you are thinking about." But there's more to it than that, especially now in the year 2020. It's not just that they know what we are thinking about, but they are changing the way the masses of the Western world, and because of globalization, increasingly elsewhere, they're changing the way we think about all dimensions of society. One of the best analyses, if you want to deepen in this, was written by a Jewish and liberal journalist, Franklin Foer. The 2017 book, World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech, which was a New York Times notable book. The agenda is to finish off the destruction of the civilization built by us Catholics, Western civilization, by spreading the values of the cultural Marxist revolution of 1968. In other words, radical individuality, unrestrained freedom, the gender ideology, unrestricted immigration, and the global open society as promoted by George Soros's Open Society Project. For more information on that, just Google Open Society Project of George Soros. He's pretty open about it. He's so powerful, he doesn't need to hide it. The result is all of these processes homogenize people. As Foer stated, this is a nascent stage in the total automation and homogenization of social, political, and intellectual life. The success is evident in the rising generations, such as the millennials, Generation Y, which is also known with reason as the burnout generation. They know practically nothing of their identity. They know a few sound bites from history, which they are not able to connect together. They have absolutely no clue to their Western identity, and they know nothing about Catholicism, thanks largely to the utterly inept programs with which they have been educated in Catholic programs. Foer and other experts try to find solutions. They're calling, for example, for legal limits to be set to the Big Four's influence. Fine, good. But these, ladies and gentlemen, are only band-aid solutions. They don't resolve the deep causes of the problems. The in-depth solution can only be found in Catholicism, because Catholicism has the blueprints, has the genetic code for the civilization that built the West, that built Europe. But Catholicism is not an abstraction. You don't know Catholicism by reading about it, but by attending the place and the event where it happens, where you feel it, touch it, where it is heard. And that occurred in one event, one series of events, the Mass and the liturgy, known as the traditional Latin Mass and liturgy. It was there that the vanguards shaped themselves. This was the liturgy that Patrick brought to Ireland. It was the one he enacted on the Hill of Slane, that Easter Vigil night that drew upon him the fury of the Druidic priesthood and the political powers of the Ireland of the time. If so many Irish and other Europeans today are joining neo-pagan religions, reviving old Celtic pagan customs, it is because some of them at least are in a warped way searching for an identity, their roots, something to grasp in this constantly changing, destabilized world. Why is the traditional Latin Mass and liturgy the key to Catholic and Western identity? Because it shows you who you are, because it is the perfect example of the statement by the modern sociologist and philosopher of communication theory, Marshall McLuhan, stated, "The medium is the message." In other words, the message of Catholicism is most perfectly embodied and expressed in the traditional Latin Mass. Everything in that Mass and liturgy, its symbolism, its texts, its ceremonials, its language, makes it a large open window onto the message of Catholicism. Real Catholicism, integral Catholicism, eternal Catholicism, not fake Catholicism. Why? Because it was not the product of the 1960s. It is a living reality, an organism that gradually, naturally reached perfection from the 1st century to the 9th century, and then was pretty much, outside of a few variations, set in stone. But it was set in stone in the 9th century under Charlemagne and Alcuin, precisely, and this is very important to understand, at the very moment that Europe was acquiring its identity, when Europeans were beginning to realize that they were Europeans, and they were acquiring their identity through this institution of the traditional Latin Mass and all of the liturgy associated with it, which is totally different to anything that we experience nowadays. Just totally different. But not only will you discover your Catholic identity in this Mass, but you'll discover your Western identity. Why is this? Because in the traditional Latin liturgy, in that 9th century, there occurred the harmonious integration of the four men who are inside you: the Greek, the Roman, the Jew, and the Celtic Teutonic. In other words, the Western psyche is inside you through this Mass, because the Western psyche is what shapes and structures the symbolism, the text, the ceremonial of this complex ritual. Greek civilization's rationality, Roman civilization's sense of law and order, and most sublimely, the Celtic Teutonic deep religious sentiment, and most sublimely, the divine revelation of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, with its 2,000 years sense of religiosity going back to the peaks of Mount Sinai in the desert. So it really embodies 4,000 years of history. In it you find 4,000 years of your history, of what makes you, you. That is why the enemies of Catholicism, the intellectuals who do understand what the traditional Latin Mass is all about, whether they're outside Catholicism or inside Catholicism, that's why they violently oppose it. Second reason, because, I quote, as the German Klaus Gamber stated, it is a rock of stability in a period of upheaval and never-ending change. The British communist Douglas Hyde, when he was just about to convert to Catholicism, had this experience. At 11:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, I was twiddling the knob of my radio. This was about 1945. Unable to get out to midnight Mass, well, just after he converted, I wanted at least to bring it to my fireside. And as I switched from one European station to the next, I tuned in to one midnight Mass after the other. Belgium, France, Germany, Era, yes, even behind the Iron Curtain in Prague. It seemed as though the whole of what was once Christendom was celebrating what is potentially the most unifying event in man's history. And the important thing was that it was the same Mass. I am a newcomer to the Mass, but I was able to recognize its continuity as I went from station to station, for it was in one common language. This aspect of Catholicism is but a single one, and maybe not the most important, but I have a strong feeling that it is precisely the Catholicism of the Catholic Church which may prove the greatest attraction and will meet the greatest need for my disillusioned generation. Reason number 3, because the traditional Mass of the Ages communicates the truths of Catholicism transparently and fully. In all its intellectual complexity, in all its tremendous mystery, fearsome depth, defiant challenge to the world, tender solace, and power of regeneration. When you find truth, as you well know, you find meaning. When you find meaning, you find peace. And you find creativity. As historians and sociologists have noted, Catholicism was remarkably successful up to the 1960s in providing artistic creative minorities for Western civilization. The non-Catholic art historian Charlene Spretnak, in her 2014 book, The Spiritual Dynamic in Modern Art, Art History Reconsidered, sought to present why there were so many Catholic artists of tremendous talent during the 19th and 20th century. Her conclusion, a remarkable conclusion for a non-Catholic, was that those born prior to the 1960s had an aesthetically enriching experience from childhood due to the traditional Latin Mass and liturgy. I quote, "These artists grew up in a world alive with divine grace, albeit one in which the dangers of sin were warned against repeatedly. Moreover, the spiritual culture in which these impressionable, aesthetically inclined children were raised was centred on a heady art form that was the traditional Catholic Mass, which incorporated visual, poetic, musical, ritual, and aromatic arts. The Mass, she added, the Mass itself was part of a larger worldview, a vast synthesis of spiritual depth and beauty. In effect, this aesthetically rich spiritual formation in childhood provided a feeder system for the arts. End quote. Reason number 4, because it shapes the Catholic psyche. The dominant decadent culture in which you and I have the privilege of living, ladies and gentlemen, is creating individuals in which emotionalism and egotistic passions create a culture that can well be defined as the selfie culture, which has effectively destroyed authentic masculinity, femininity, marriage, and family. One instance of this is what sociological polls in the United States, Americans love polls, that around 80% of males and 60% of females are in varying degrees defocused in daily living due to internet. And as neurologists show, this has profound implications for relationships, for ability for in-depth concentration on metaphysical issues such as the meaning to human existence. The antidote is a powerful spiritual experience, but it must work according to the normal functioning of the human psyche. That is where the traditional Mass comes in. The traditional Mass, as psychologists have studied it, sculpts gradually, almost imperceptibly, the mind and the heart of the Catholic in accord with its natural structure and the divinely revealed certainties. Why? Because, as we said earlier, it is the combination of Greek rationality, of Roman sense of order. That Roman sense of order whereby the Romans disdained emotionalism. The Roman gravitas, seriousness, that characterized especially the elites of Rome who built their civilization. The Celtic, our Celtic, and we can be proud of it, passion. Celtic Teutonic passion. And then the sublime Jewish gospel revelation. But all of this, it combines, preserving, therefore, the natural hierarchy of the mental powers of man, whereby the will, or acting, or deciding is governed by our rationality. And the rationality and the will both channel the passions and the emotions. That, ladies and gentlemen, is countercultural in the world of today, where the mass media and many of the forces of consumerism purposely increment emotionalism in order to manipulate us. It does this in a very effective way by creating something that is non-existent in modern society: silence. Silence, so vital a need for the heart. When I was on a long drive, an emergency in the United States with a taxi driver, I'll never forget, I told her at the beginning, I'm going to be praying now, so no radio. So I was worried at the end. When I was about to get out, I said, did you get nervous because of all the silence? And she was a typical good-hearted American non-Catholic woman, and she said to me, Reverend, I'd never had an experience like this in my whole life. This was wonderful. Silence, so vital a need for the heart, the womb in which genius, creativity and conversion are born. And let us not forget, silence as the ladies appreciate with their greater feminine sensitivity, silence is the language of lovers. As Carlyle remarked, under all speech that is good for anything, there lies a silence that is better. Silence is deep as eternity. And then there's Gregorian chant, music that modern scientists have discovered fosters serenity by increasing the production of alpha waves in the brain. And finally, this ain't going to be so popular, fasting. Fasting is tied into the ancient rite. There's no fasting in the new rite. There's serious fasting, ladies and gentlemen, the old. If Catholicism had kept fasting, kept the old liturgy, there wouldn't be the obesity problem in the United States right now. Fasting is a marvelous way to increase mental alertness and indirectly, therefore, to prevent mental manipulation. And also, as psychologists confirm, but as Thomas Aquinas said long, long ago, if you want to conquer lust and channel sexual passion, fast. Fifth reason, and we're going to go faster. It makes the Catholic proud to be Catholic. It's full of beauty. All those 150 converts that were analysed from tip to toe by the sociologist, their first impression of the traditional Latin Mass was beauty. Now, you won't get that immediately with the low Mass, the simple form of it. But even there, after your first shock, you'll see beauty. Reason number 6. It focuses Catholic thinking, action and lifestyle by its God-centeredness. Reason number 7. Because through the ancient Mass, the Catholic learns to live time in the light of eternity. In other words, time in the light of the purpose of life. How does it achieve this? By facing east. In the biblical worldview, the east symbolizes the 3 deepest dimensions of reality: eternity, history, and the Lord of history. It shows you how you should be journeying in life, away from the West, which in the biblical view of the world is the reign of darkness, towards the light, the eternal undying light of heaven, which God passionately wants us to attain. So passionately, it cost him the passion. The Catholic therefore learns to journey east. If you want to discover how the Catholics realize this, Google soldiers at Mass World War II. Look at all those American, English, Irish, New Zealand, German troops kneeling in the mud on battlefields, gathered around the altar where the priest and they were facing, both of them, eastwards. How it gave them strength in those horrendous struggles of World War II. And because of that, you have an attitude about using time which prevents discouragement. The Catholic author J.R.R. Tolkien, who was passionately devoted to the traditional Latin Mass, presented the Catholic attitude to time in the face of discouragement in The Lord of the Rings. He put the Catholic attitude in the mouth of Gandalf. When the disheartened Frodo expressed discouragement in the face of the power of the enemy in Mordor, Frodo said, "I wish all of this need not have happened in my time." Gandalf looked at him, was silent for a while, and then replied, "So do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. Reason 8. Because the Mass of the Ages clearly communicates what the Mass is: the sacrifice. It thunders the fact that it is the sacrifice, the mystical enactment, the representing of the central event of history, the passion and death of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, the event to which every man and woman must unite themselves, even if only implicitly, if they are to attain their purpose for existing. The Mass is not a communion service. It's not a prayer service. It's not a Bible reading service. It's not a preaching ceremony. It's the sacrifice. The Norwegian novelist, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1928, Sigrid Undset, a marvelous woman, extraordinary woman, a convert to Catholicism, she illustrates insightfully the first encounter of a 20th century Norwegian university student who attended the traditional Mass for the first time in a little Norwegian church. He had been out for a night drinking with his friends. Now he was sober at the end of it. But when he came back to his landlady's house, she was heading out at something like 6:30 in the morning to go to the chapel for Mass. So she was about to pass by him. She looked at him with disdain. And then he said to her something that had been on his mind for a while. "Can I come with you to your service?" She hesitated. And then, seeing he was sober enough, said, "Okay, follow me." Frau Gotas, the landlady, was rather an imposing woman. Sigrid Undset describes the reaction of the young Norwegian, and it illustrates what the barbarians felt when they saw the traditional Mass for the first time. I quote, "He had never before been inside a Catholic church. He tried to grasp the meaning of some of the things the priest was doing before the altar. But the man, he turned his back to the people the whole time, and they could not possibly hear a word of what he was whispering while he moved about up there doing things. And by degrees, as Paul discovered that the service must be in full swing, and the deep silence prevailed in the empty, sunlit church, and the few people in the seats continued to kneel as though lost in self-contemplation, he felt a kind of thrill. Why, yes, this was beautiful in its way. He suddenly thought he understood what people meant when they spoke of the invisible God. He could imagine that priest and people were gathered together here to worship something invisible. And he thought to himself, this form of service could not possibly have any other meaning, for there was nothing here of the priest turning to the congregation and concerning himself with them. It was rather as though this man took the lead in conducting some worship or other. And for the first time in his life, the teenager thought he could perceive some sense in divine worship. In this silent adoration, he could imagine that the Supreme Being was present to receive their souls. And he thought, of course, it must have been a similar form of Christianity that had possessed the force for so colossal an expansion in Europe, in Norway. But then, that was before, in the 16th century, it became the preaching religion that had dominated this country ever since. very rapidly. In conclusion, reason number 9, because it inspires the characteristic Catholic lifestyle, in total contradiction to the dominant lifestyle of the moment. The Mass of the Ages meant one thing for your grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents who went out to the Mass rocks. It meant going to be with the heroic God-man who sacrificed his life for love of them on the hill of Calvary. The Mass for them was personal. It was about being close to the hero, the great hero of history, their Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, who shed his blood for love of them. The Mass was deeply personal. And because it was the heroic sacrifice of the heroic God-man, they adopted a lifestyle which can be termed the sacrificial lifestyle. A lifestyle of sacrificial love, and it showed in millions of heroic wives and mothers, husbands and fathers, knights, nobles, kings and queens, artists, sculptors, writers, in a civilization that none other has ever equaled. Reason number 10, because it gives Catholics a clear awareness of their mission to convert non-Catholics to the one true faith, because that is to give them the greatest possible gift you could ever give them, and to create a Catholic society and civilization. Reason 11, because it inspires Catholics to stand up, fight for, defend the Catholic faith, Catholic civilization and society. As it did with Charles Martel, as it did with the knights who went to defend their brother Christians in the Middle East from massacre, as it did for Catholics for centuries. Reason 12, because as Viktor Frankl and modern psychologists have confirmed, it is man's greatest need to find overarching meaning to life. And an overarching meaning to life gives a sense of fulfillment. And what does a sense of fulfillment do? It creates a serene society. Sociologists have found in the past few decades an extraordinary statistic, which the enemies of Catholicism are very careful to hide. In contemporary society, there is enormous use of antidepressants, and there is extraordinarily high suicide rates. However, Philippe Ariès, a French sociologist, in his seminal study, Western Attitudes Towards Death from the Middle Ages to the Present, arrived to this conclusion. I quote, "The truth is that probably at no time has man so loved life as he did in the Catholic Middle Ages." And then the sociologist Alexander Murray, in his publication Suicide in the Middle Ages, gave figures and statistics to back up this assertion. I quote, "The starkest difference between medieval and modern suicide is in the rate per 100,000 of population. Modern rates are usually judged this way and run between approximately 3 and, say, 25. But," the sociologist concluded, "I can wrangle no medieval source into suggesting a higher rate than around 1, and even that involves much speculation." As another set of sociologists concluded, the unified worldview of the Catholic Middle Ages bestowed peace and happiness as long as it satisfied men. There was no suicide tendency. And I conclude, 2,000 years have handed in their verdict. The traditional Latin Mass is where the Catholic vanguards are born, educated, and encouraged. Because in the traditional Latin Mass, Catholic creative minorities will experience the central event of history, the heroic sacrifice of the God-man on that Friday afternoon 2,000 years ago. Face to face with him, they will breathe in his heroism, the heroism that history shows imbued zeal to missionaries, fortitude to martyrs, solace to hermits, inspiration to artists, musicians and architects, peace to the multitudes, century after century, generation after generation, for 2 millennia, and will do so again, today, now, and into the future.